John chapter 4 is where we're going to be this morning. It's the story of the woman at the well. I've been pretty excited for the last several weeks to get to this story, and I believe that there are some pretty incredible insights and truths that the Lord is going to bless you with this morning. Well, it's hard to describe in modern terms as we look into this story of this Samaritan woman at the well, how much Jews and Samaritans hated each other. Perhaps the best modern example I can give you of such regional hatred is the rivalry between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants. And you're like, how bad is that rivalry? Here's how bad it was. You see these two dudes on the screen. In 2011, the Giants fan on the right, Brian Stowe, attended opening day at Dodger Stadium. After the game, in the parking lot, he got into an altercation with some fans from the other team, and they beat him so mercilessly that he was left with permanent brain damage. The other man, Dodgers fan Jonathan Denver, left a game in the 8th inning to head to a nearby bar. Outside the bar, he got into a confrontation with some Giants fans, and it escalated so rapidly that the Giants fan pulled out a knife, stabbed him, and murdered him all over a baseball game. Now, how tragic and how senseless that lives will be lost and destroyed over a game. And yet that senselessness pales in comparison to the hatred that went on for generations between Jews and Samaritans. That's the background with which we enter this story. The story of the Samaritan woman at the well needs to be read on two levels. It needs to be read on the level of the actual story. There was a woman who legitimately met with Jesus. It was a historical happening. It also needs to be read on a spiritual level as we see that God was using this story to picture what he was doing in the world. What was he doing in the world? Well, we have to remember the story that John, the gospel writer, has been writing. The light came into the world. Remember, it says he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. The one who made the world came into that which he made, and they didn't know who he was. But the text says there would be some who would receive him. There would be some who would believe in his name. And to those he would give the right to become children of God. And here's what's going on. The king came to the kingdom he had created, and the kingdom didn't know its king. But bit by bit, piece by piece, territory by territory, the king had come to reclaim his land. He had come to reclaim his people. And this woman would show that the king had come to Samaria to reclaim it. That's why we titled this morning's message, The King Reclaims His Territory. And this morning we're going to look at this familiar story through 4 unique lenses. And I believe you'll leave today with a fresh understanding of what God had done and a fresh glimpse of the mercy of God. So here's the first lens. The first lens is this was a new mission to an old foe. And let's read the text and then we'll walk through it. Here's what it says starting in verse 1. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more than John, although Jesus himself didn't baptize but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and it was necessary, he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour, and a woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food, and the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Let's pause right there. To understand this story, you have to understand the hatred between Jews and Samaritans. And so Jesus wanting to avoid controversy with the Pharisees, decided that he was going to relocate his ministry. Now, if you remember the geography of Israel, there were kind of three parts in ancient Israel. There was the southern part, Judea, there was the northern part, Galilee, and Samaria was smack dab in the middle. Now, Judea and Galilee were filled with 100% pure-blooded ethnic Jews, but Samaria was filled with a half-breed. They were half Jew, half Gentile. And so typically, in order to avoid this despised group, Jewish people, when they would travel from north to south or south to north, would walk all the way around to the east. You see that route highlighted on the map in the red. They would go all the way around so that they didn't have to take the shorter route. Why would they do that? What was so wrong with Samaria? Who were the Samaritans? To understand who the Samaritans were, we have to tell the story of Israel way before the exile. So when Israel was still under King David and then King Solomon, remember that they split under Solomon's son Rehoboam, and they became two different nations. And so there was the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom kept the name Israel, but they put their capital city in Samaria. And so this northern kingdom, capital city Samaria, were conquered by Assyria in 722 BC. And when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, he hauled away most of the inhabitants in exile. He exported those people, but he imported Gentile people to fill in the land. And so there were a few Jewish people who were left who avoided being exported, but there were all these Gentile people imported, and the Jews who were left and the Gentiles who came in over time intermarried and created a new race that wasn't quite Jewish but wasn't fully Gentile, and these became the Samaritans. The Samaritans and the Jews hated each other. So significant was their hatred that the Samaritans wouldn't go worship at the temple in Jerusalem. They made their own temple. But about 150 years or so before the time of Jesus, there was this brief window where the nation of Israel got their independence again. They'd been dominated by Greeks and eventually would be dominated by Rome, but there was this brief little window in the middle where they had their own independent nation again. It was under the Maccabean dynasty. And when the Jews got control of their nation, the first thing they did is they went to Samaria and they destroyed the Samaritans' temple located on Mount Gerizim. They're like, we are going to destroy this half-breed of people. That's how significant the hatred was. How did the Samaritans respond? Well, like, you hurt our temple, we're going to hurt yours. And so they smuggled bags of dead bones into the temple in Jerusalem because they knew that that would make it ritually unclean. And so it was just this constant back and forth. And so then the Jewish rabbis declared that Samaritan women were perpetually and always unclean. Super gross, the detail they went into to describe how unclean Samaritan women were. If you want to know the details, ask me after the service. But it's safe to say these groups hated each other. And then the text says Jesus had to go through Samaria. Did you see that in verse 4? He didn't have to go through Samaria in the sense of he could have taken the same route that everyone else usually took. He didn't have to go through Samaria. He wasn't in an urgent deadline that it was required of him to pass through that territory. No, he had to go through Samaria because God had a divine appointment for him there. There was a divine necessity that the Father sent the Son to these people. It gets interesting. The place where Jesus encounters a woman used to belong to one of the patriarchs of God's people, a man named Jacob. This was a key place in Israelite history. But this key place in Israelite history now belongs to a group of people who worship halfway, but not all the way. We call that heterodox worship, where you mix true worship and false worship together. So you have this messed up worship by these messed up half-breed people, and Jesus shows up. And when does Jesus show up? It's interesting. The text tells us, it says, verse 6, it was about the 6th hour. You're like, okay, what does that mean? Well, they counted their days from sunrise all the way around. So 0 o'clock, if you will, is about 6 a.m. So the 6th hour is noon. And in that Mediterranean context, noon is the peak of the sun. And here's what you need to remember. John has been telling us, the gospel writer's been telling us, that Jesus is the light. And the light walks into Samaria at the time where the sun is shining the brightest, because the light that is stronger than the sun is now here. The light is coming to reveal truth to the people. The 6th hour only appears one other time in John's gospel, and it happens in John chapter 19 and verse 14. And this is super fascinating. It says it was the day of preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour, when Pilate said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Jesus went to be crucified about the 6th hour at noon. Reminds me of a song by my favorite singer and songwriter, Andrew Peterson. Listen to these lyrics. It was high noon in the valley of the shadow, when the deep of the valley was bright, when the mouth of the tomb shouted glory, the groom is alive. So long, you wages of sin. Go on, don't you come back again. I've been raised and redeemed. You've lost all your sting to the victor of the battle. It was high noon in the valley of the shadow. I love that. At high noon, the king, the light, shows up to these people. One last observation in this section. In verse 9, we're told in parenthetical notation that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Now, in verse 8, it says that the disciples had gone into town to buy food. So when it says that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, it can't mean that they have no dealings with Samaritans whatsoever, or his disciples wouldn't have gone to buy food. So what exactly is John telling us in this parenthetical notation? Remember how I told you that Samaritan women were considered always to be unclean? This phrase translated "have no dealings with" actually can be translated, they don't drink from the same vessel. So Jesus comes to this Samaritan woman and he's like, "Give me a drink." And then we're reminded, Jewish people don't drink from the same cup as these religiously unclean, racially impure, religiously heterodox people. We shun them, we avoid them, and yet Jesus was sent by God right to them. The king was about to reclaim his territory. There was a new mission to an old foe. But let me show you the next lens through which I want us to look at this story. There was new water for the thirsty. The woman asked Jesus, "How can you ask me for a drink?" Verse 10, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." And Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give will never be thirsty again. The water that I give will become in that person a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And the woman said to Jesus, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Living water. Now here's what you need to understand about living water. When they start talking about living water, this was a well that had what they would call living water. There was this contrast between still water, stagnant water that you would find at the bottom of most wells, and living water, which would be water in a stream or a river that would flow. And they thought at that time that running water, moving water, living water was healthier than stagnant water. But this was a very unique well. This well, which is still observable today, is 100 feet deep. But when you bear down 100 feet under the earth, you come to this underground stream that is running with living water. This well, we're told, was discovered by the patriarch Jacob. Now, interestingly enough, rabbinic tradition tells us that when Jacob discovered this well, supposedly the water from 100 feet under the earth gushed up to the surface and overflowed out of the hole that had been dug for 20 years. It was miracle water given to the people because this was an area where there was no active water supply anywhere around for miles. And yet they discovered this living water under the surface. And so when the woman says to Jesus, "Are you greater than Jacob?" what she's saying is, how can you give us water that's greater than this miracle water in this miracle well that was discovered all these years ago? But what gives life to the water Jesus is talking about is not the fact that it's moving water. What gives this water life is the fact that there's something supernatural and spiritual about it. This is living water. In chapter 3, Jesus told Nicodemus he needed to be born from above, to be born of water and the Spirit. Here, Jesus offers this woman this water. And to understand living water, we need to trace the idea of water throughout the Old Testament. And when all these references come together, you get a picture of what Jesus is telling this woman. 5 verses we're going to trace. Let's start with Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 13. Here's what it says: "For my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." God says to his people, here's your issue. I've offered you living water, but you wanted to go find your own water. Not much has changed in all these thousands of years. We are broken cistern people. We want to make our own path. We want to forge our own way. And I will figure out a way to find happiness and healing in this life no matter what it takes. And I will dig my own well. We might say in modern American parlance, I will pull myself up by my bootstraps. But the common denominator is I will do it. And here's what God says. When you chase after your own thing, you're building for yourself a broken well. And there's no good water in it. And yet we chase after fame, and we chase after popularity, and we chase after money, and we chase after pleasure, and we chase after everything the world tells us that we need, and we find that we've only broken ourselves all the more. But there is hope. Listen to these 2 verses from Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 1. On that day, there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. What does water do? Water cleanses. Water washes away the junk and the sin that comes because of our shameful building our own wells. We chase after sinful paths, and God sends water to wash us and clean us up. In fact, here's the next verse from Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 8. On that day, living waters shall flow from Jerusalem. Don't you love that? Don't you love that? Here's God prophesying hundreds of years in advance before Jesus showed up to talk to this woman. And he says, there's coming a day, and on that day, living water is going to flow out of Jerusalem, half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea. I love that. He's like, there's water, and it's going everywhere, and it's going to cover the entire earth. Living water is coming. Let me tell you some more about this living water that was prophesied. The last 2 verses are from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 1. Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Are you hurting? Have you wasted all of your energy and all of your resources building a broken well that cannot satisfy? Come find living water, because there is hope for people who are hopeless. He's like, you have no money? This water is without cost. Come and get it. And here is the final prophecy about living water. Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 5. Behold, you shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you, because of the Lord your God and of the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. You get that living water, and who's it for? It's for every nation. The King has come to reclaim his territory. Every nation, every people are offered this water without cost, this water that can purify. And here is this Samaritan woman who is despised and rejected, and there is living water for her. It's time for lens number 3. There's new worship for a new era. You're like, isn't there a conversation about some husbands here? Yeah, we're going to skip that because that's the most mind-blowing insight. We're going to come back to that. We're going to skip ahead to verse 19. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Well, Jesus is he's already at this point in verses 17 and 18, revealed to her some pretty intimate personal details about her life that no passerby stranger possibly could have known. So she's like, you got to be a prophet. Now, did she mean by that you're an official ambassador for God? Probably not. Her understanding of who Jesus was growing in stages throughout their conversation. At this point, she's probably meant you're a supernaturally gifted person. And taking advantage of the fact that she's encountered a supernaturally gifted person, she asks the hot button theological question of her day. And here it is, verse 20. Our fathers worshiped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. She's like, okay, where are we supposed to worship? Our place, Mount Gerizim, or your place in Jerusalem? Verse 21. And Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming. He was called Christ. When he comes, he'll tell us everything. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Okay, so she asks this key theological question. Which temple? Samaritan temple, Mount Gerizim. Jewish temple, Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Which one's better? Where should we worship? Jesus gives her a two-part answer. Answer number 1. The Jewish temple is better. Did you see that? He's like, we worship what we know, you worship what you don't know. For salvation is from the Jews. What does he mean by saying salvation is from the Jews? Here's what he's saying. The Messiah is Jewish. God has revealed himself through a Jewish Messiah. And so the Jewish people had relationship with God. They had much to their advantage because they had the revelation of God gifted to them through the Old Testament scriptures. He's like, y'all are worshiping something you don't even know. Why didn't the Samaritans know everything? They'd cut off from themselves access to the Old Testament. The Samaritans only used the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The rest of it they considered not to be inspired, not to be the Word of God. They had no idea the details of this Messiah that was coming. And so Jesus says to her, you people are worshiping what you don't even know. But then he says, oh, but by the way, it's not like that matters a whole lot, because a new era is coming. And a new era is coming where there will be a new kind of worship. And you're not going to worship here, and you're not going to worship there. You're going to worship in spirit and in truth. And here's what's going on. Jesus is the true temple, and people are going to worship Jesus wherever Jesus is, not in a physical building on any mountain. Now, this is big news to the Samaritans, because the Samaritans were doing then what a lot of Jewish people are doing now. They're waiting to rebuild their temple. So remember I told you that the Samaritan temple got razed to the ground by the Maccabean dynasty? So in that time, when Jesus was talking to the Samaritan woman, the Samaritans were actually gathering vessels in Mount Gerizim and just waiting for the right leader to come along so they could rebuild their Samaritan temple. And so their hope in their religion was, we're going to rebuild the Samaritan temple. And Jesus says to this woman, no, don't think that what you're waiting for is a building to get rebuilt. I'm offering you living water. I'm offering you a new place to worship. I'm offering you new hope that transcends anything you could possibly imagine. He's like, I'm offering you the ability to worship in spirit and truth. Now, here's how I used to hear this passage taught. In fact, to my shame, I've probably taught it this way before. I used to say, worship in spirit and truth means this. Spirit, rah! We love Jesus. Truth, rich theological content. And then I'd say, okay, worship pastor guy, here's how you need to plan a service. Your song should have spirit, they should fire up the soul, and they should have truth, rich theological meaning. That's probably a good principle, but it has nothing, 0% to do with what Jesus is saying here in this passage. And you're like, how do you know that? Well, because grammar. And here's what I mean. If you were here when I taught through the beginning of John chapter 3, I told you that there's a rule of Greek grammar where if there's one Greek preposition and two words that it's working with, that those two words have to basically mean the same thing. They can't be opposite. And we got the same construction going here. You must worship in, that's a preposition, spirit and truth. Those are the two nouns. So those two things have to be the same thing. They can't be different things. And so it can't be spirit, rah, 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 and truth, the rich theological meaning, because those would be opposites or different things. Spirit and truth have to be meaning the same thing. So what exactly is this spirit and truth then that Jesus is talking about? This is John chapter 3. How do we have a relationship with God? You must be born from above. You must be born of water and spirit. Jesus is, according to John 14:6, the way and the truth and the life. And so the one who offers living water also offers us his spirit and his truth. And this is what transforms us. This is what Jesus is saying to the Samaritan woman. He's saying, you cannot change you, and you cannot fix you. And you, as a broken cistern person, have been looking for hope in all the wrong places. But God offers you new life from above, and that life can come into you, and it can radically remake you. God does the work. God gives you living water to drink, and the Holy Spirit will wash away your sin and put a new heart in you that loves God and longs to obey him. That is spirit and truth worship. And so the woman hears this and she backs up. She goes, okay. She's like, I know that Messiah is coming. And when he comes, he'll explain all of this to us. Now the Samaritans, because they had this like half and half worship, had a very different understanding of the Messiah than the Jewish people did. They had a different word for Messiah. The Samaritan word for Messiah was to have. And the to have, this Samaritan Messiah that they believed was coming, was supposed to be the one who would teach them everything. Their Messiah was a teacher. The Jews believed that their Messiah was going to be one who would restore the fortunes of Israel and remake God's people into a dominant world empire. And so you could say it this way: the Samaritans were looking for a teacher, the Jews were looking for a king. And Jesus was both. Jesus was the to have and the Mashiach. He was the fulfillment of all those expectations because the Mashiach king had come to reclaim his territory in Samaria by teaching this Samaritan woman what living water was, what spirit and truth worship could actually do. And so she's like, okay, Messiah will teach us these things. Tehev will teach us these things. And Jesus looks at this woman in John chapter 4, verse 26. He says, ego eimi. Have you heard that phrase? It's just translated, I am. The English translations don't give us the full picture of that. They add the pronoun he so that we'll know that he's applying that term to himself, but that's not what it says in the Greek. It just says, ego eimi, I am. The same two words by which God introduced himself to Moses. Who is the divine sovereign? Who is King of kings and Lord of lords? I am. And Jesus uses these two words that describe the identity of God and applies them to himself. These two words that appeared even in the books that the Samaritans read, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And everyone who heard someone use those words to describe themselves would know that this is a claim to be God. Jesus says, I am, meaning the Messiah, but he also says, I am, meaning that the Messiah is God. He is the one who can offer us the cleansing from sin. He is the one who can offer us new birth from above. He is the one who can wash away our past and our junk and give us a fresh start. And everything that we've been chasing in our broken cisterns, we find in Jesus Christ. But there's one more lens that I want us to look through about this story. This is my favorite lens, and this is a lens that I just learned about this week as I studied. I think it's mind-blowing, this insight. Jesus was offering or bringing a new matriarch for a new covenant people. Let me explain. Back to the verses we skipped. Jesus said to the woman, go, call your husband and come here. And the woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you are right in saying you have no husband. You have had 5 husbands, and the one you have is not your husband. What you have said is true. That sounds like a really harsh interaction, but there is so much beauty in this interaction. Let me explain it for you. If you're a Sunday school all-star, you probably remember the stories in the Old Testament about Abraham's offspring and where they found their wives. So remember, Abraham had Isaac, he had Jacob, and Isaac and Jacob, at times in their lives, needed to find wives. And they were living among pagan people, so they had to go back to their homeland to find a bride that they could actually marry. And, well, these were agricultural guys. They were farmers, Abraham and his descendants. So when they wanted to find wives, they didn't go on Fox's new reality show, Farmer Needs a Wife. Please, please, please tell me you have not watched that show. And I saw the ads for that, and I'm like, we're just getting stupider in our television. So these guys, instead of doing something dumb like that, they went to wells. And farmer finds wife at well. That was the ongoing theme of Genesis. That's where these guys found their wives. And so here's Jesus, and he shows up at a well. And there's a single man meeting a single woman. And when she says, I have no husband, your Hallmark movie radar should be on high alert. This could be a love connection. And yet Jesus very quickly shoots down that love connection when he's like, yeah, you're right. You don't have a husband. You've had 5. And now you're with a dude who you're not even married to. What do we know about that? Jewish tradition tells us that a woman who had had more than 3 husbands was to be considered morally suspect. And so this woman had a background that would be disparaged. However, here's what I want you to know. Only in that culture, only Jewish men could spark a divorce. A woman couldn't just leave and divorce her husband. Only a man could initiate the divorce proceedings. Perhaps this woman had been abused and discarded by man after man. Perhaps she'd had husbands who had died. We don't know the details as to why she's had 5 husbands. Now, oftentimes when you hear this story taught and preached, it's assumed that this woman has done something very morally questionable to be in the position that she's in. That's why sometimes it's helpful to read a commentary by a female commentary writer. So Marianne May Thompson wrote this in her commentary. Jesus calls attention to her problematic situation, but he does not condemn her. Subsequently, commentators and preachers have hastened to fill that void. We've heaped condemnation on her, where Jesus simply observes the problems that she's going through. Here's what we can assume. She was desperate, and she needed a man's money and a man's protection, because in that culture, if a woman had no man, she very likely could not make money. She very likely could not provide for herself. She wouldn't have a place to live. She wouldn't have food to eat. And so she would face dreaded choices of either starving or doing horrific things to try to make money. And what this woman needed was not a broken cistern of trying to fix her problem by connecting with whatever dude would hang out with a woman who had been married 5 times, and this guy was willing to provide for her but wasn't willing to shelter her under the covenant of marriage. And Jesus is like, that's not the broken cistern you need. What you need is living water. Lots of suggestions when you hear this passage taught about why this woman was at the well at noon. It's often taught that this woman was coming to the well at noon because she was a social outcast. As someone who had been married and then not married 5 times, she was either too embarrassed or too shunned to be associated with the rest of the people, and so therefore she had to go draw water in the heat of the day, when typically people would draw water at the beginning of the day or at the evening when it was cooler. That's what's often taught, but let's not buy into that interpretation, because here's why. That interpretation causes us to assume the inner psychology of what this woman was thinking. I think better to let the text interpret itself. And so let's use the Old Testament to interpret the New Testament. And was there another time when a person showed up at a well at noon? And indeed there is. Back in Genesis chapter 29 and verse 7, Rachel showed up at a well at noon. You see there in the text, it says, it is still high day. In Hebrew, it's noon. And Rachel, who's about to marry Jacob, shows up at the well at noon. And yet, when you heard that story taught in Sunday school, nobody was like, Rachel showed up at the well at noon because she was an outcast and nobody wanted anything to do with her. No. So here's what's going on. Rachel showed up at the well at noon because God had a divine appointment for her. She was supposed to meet and marry Jacob and become a matriarch of Israel, God's old covenant people. And here this woman shows up at the well at noon. Why? Because God has a divine appointment for her. And she is supposed to meet and be united to a man who will bring her into the new covenant people. Hear this. This woman is the first convert in Jesus' ministry. It's shocking. Of all the people Jesus could have chosen, you read through the Gospel of John, who's the first person who believes in Jesus and has their life transformed? This woman. And what happens to this woman? She goes on to become the first evangelist, and she's going to reclaim her town for Jesus Christ. And let me say it this way. She met Jesus, and she didn't marry Jesus the way Jacob married Rachel. But no, something even better. She met Jesus, and she was brought into the bride of Christ. And being brought into the bride of Christ, she became the first female convert, the matriarch, the mother of faith for the new covenant of people who worship in the new spirit and truth era, who worship in spirit and truth, whose lives are cleaned up by the gospel. And we love to think that person isn't someone God would want. That person is too far gone. And Jesus has a divine appointment to go and meet this woman at this place. And I'm talking to you this morning if you walked into church and think God doesn't have anything left for me. I've done too much. I've sinned too much. I'm too far gone. Jesus comes for you because he loves you and he offers you living water. He will wash away your sin. He will clean up your junk and he will make you part of the people of God. But there's one other insight, and it's been building up to this. The woman's life pictures her people, Samaria. Did the woman have 5 husbands in real life? I believe she did. But I believe we can read that at an even deeper level. I believe that these 5 husbands had symbolic meaning as well. To understand that, look back to 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 24. So remember how I told you that Assyria conquered the northern kingdom and he imported all these Gentiles to come and live in that area? Who did the king of Assyria bring to come and live in Samaria? The king of Assyria brought people from, let's count, Babylon, Cuthan, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. 5. 5 Gentile nations imported into Samaria. This woman had 5 husbands. And the one she is now with is not her husband. Rome, this imperial overseeing empire, was now in charge of Samaria, but didn't actually bring their people there. That's 6. And then Jesus comes. The 7th, perfect man. The one who can bring living water. And Samaria, as a nation, had been a broken well nation, looking to find God in their fake religion, looking to find God on Mount Gerizim, looking to find God by cutting off large portions of the Old Testament. And Jesus came as the 7th perfect man to that abandoned nation. And he said, I am bringing you into the bride of Christ. And how will he do that? By offering living water to those people. Next week, we're going to see how this woman goes and brings her entire town to faith in Jesus Christ. I want to look at one last verse in Revelation chapter 22. How do people get brought to Jesus Christ when they've abandoned and ignored him, when they've been chasing all these broken wells instead of running to the Lord? Listen to the offer. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let the one who hears say, come. And let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who desires take the water that is without price. How can we be restored to Jesus Christ, to eternal life? Come get the living water. Maybe you need the living water this morning. Maybe you've been running after path and path and path that has not satisfied your soul. Maybe you've been chasing dreams that seem to shatter right in front of you, and you're looking for hope, and you're looking for healing. And hear this, Jesus Christ himself would say to you through the words of the book of Revelation, come get the living water. Come to Jesus that he will wash you and clean you up. Because on the cross, Jesus shed his blood to cover your sin, and the blood of Jesus can be that living water for you that makes you new, that heals your sin by paying the penalty you deserved to pay and giving you new life and new birth. here's what we're going to do to wrap the service this morning. We're going to take communion in just a moment, but I want to give you opportunity to reflect on what God might be saying to your heart. So as the band comes, they're going to play a song over you. I'll invite you to just be seated and reflect during this song. Maybe you need to pray and ask the Lord to give you living water for the first time this morning. Maybe you've received that living water and you just want to celebrate and be thankful for what God's done in your life. But take these moments, reflect on the beauty and the mercy of God, and then we'll come and take communion together.
your grace I'm made what I'm not, my unrelenting, my ever-creating, my ever-chasing God.
What a powerful song. Our God chased after us. When we were chasing broken wells, he came and chased us down and offered his son Jesus on the cross. I'll invite you to take your communion elements with me. It's our opportunity to respond and say, Lord Jesus, I need to take you inside of me. That by taking this bread and this juice into ourselves, what we're saying is, I need Jesus inside of me. I need his body. I need his blood, because I need to be united with him. And Jesus, the night before he went to the cross, took a piece of bread and broke it. He gave it to his disciples. And he said, take and eat. This is my body broken for you. Let's eat and remember the broken body of Jesus. Then Jesus took a cup. He said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Drink this in remembrance of me. Let's drink and remember the blood of Jesus shed for us. So God, we thank you that you chased us down in love. We thank you that you let yourself die on a tree. And we thank you that the death you died could not defeat you, and the grave you were in could not hold you, but that resurrection won victory. We thank you that in you we have new life because we've been raised to life with you. So we thank you for your body, and we thank you for your blood.